I had spent most of the day tidying up the house, the soft hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen providing a kind of background rhythm to my thoughts. The late afternoon sunlight was slanting through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the living room carpet. I had just settled into my favorite armchair with a cup of tea when I heard laughter booming from the other side of the hallway. My husband's friends had come over for their usual weekend visit. Three men who had grown a little too fond of the wine cabinet in the past few hours, judging by the sound of their voices. Normally, I liked them well enough. They were kind-hearted, often funny and harmless, but today something about the way their laughter rolled through the house felt different, more boisterous, less contained. I glanced at the clock, noting it was still early evening. My husband was likely finishing up in the garage, oblivious to the increasing chaos inside. I tried to refocus on my tea, sipping slowly, letting the warmth settle in my hands. But then came the creak of the hallway door. I looked up, and before I could react, all three of them were spilling into the room at once, unannounced and unsteady. "Oh, sorry, we didn't mean to," one of them began, slurring slightly, but it didn't matter. They were already standing there, close enough that I could feel the heat from their presence, their laughter mixing with the faint smell of wine and the faint tang of cigars from the garage. I laughed nervously, setting my cup down on the table. "Well, this is unexpected," I said, trying to keep my voice light. I wasn't expecting visitors right now. They grinned sheepishly, swaying a little as they took tentative steps further into the room. One of them, the tallest of the three, rubbed the back of his neck. "We just wanted to, check in, make sure the party was going okay," he said, voice warm but unsteady. There was something almost childlike about their clumsiness, and for a moment I felt a mixture of amusement and a strange, unexplainable warmth. Their eyes weren't leering. They were soft, open, and almost apologetic. They weren't intruding to be disrespectful. They were just human, imperfect, and a little lost in their own merriment. I gestured to the couch. "Why don't you all sit down for a minute?" They obeyed, lowering themselves onto the cushions with careful balance, still chuckling quietly to themselves. I poured another cup of tea, this time for the tallest man, and handed it over. His fingers brushed mine briefly, and I was surprised at the electric warmth that ran through me, a spark of connection that felt wholly innocent yet profoundly intimate. We settled into an awkward but comforting silence. Outside, the sunlight waned further, casting a muted glow through the blinds. I found myself noticing the subtle details, the way one of them fidgeted with his cuff, the quiet sigh of relief from another as he leaned back, the sincere smile that never quite left the face of the third. It was a moment of vulnerability, almost fragile, and I realized that these small human gestures were far more captivating than any grand display of charm or bravado. For the first time that day, I felt my shoulders relax. I laughed softly at a small joke one of them made, and the sound echoed gently in the room, a simple melody of shared human experience. I didn't know what the rest of the evening would hold, but at that moment I felt a quiet certainty. Sometimes the unexpected could bring with it a rare and subtle joy, the kind that seeps in slowly and lingers long after the moment has passed. The room felt smaller now, almost cozy, the soft shadows stretching across the walls as the evening deepened. I could hear the faint tick of the wall clock, but it seemed almost irrelevant compared to the quiet hum of our conversation. We weren't talking about anything particularly important, just stories from the week, half-forgotten jokes, small complaints about work and errands, but somehow the rhythm felt soothing. One of them, the one who always had the gentlest voice, started telling a story about a fishing trip he had taken years ago. His words were unpolished, stumbling a little over the sentences, but the way he laughed at his own mistakes made me laugh too, and soon the other two joined in. I watched them as they laughed, their faces loosening in ways that only happened when someone felt safe, unjudged. There was an honesty in that laughter, a rawness that was surprisingly comforting. I found myself leaning back in my chair, observing them more than participating, letting the warm glow of the room and the gentle cadence of their voices wrap around me. It struck me how rarely I allowed myself to just sit and watch people, to notice the small quirks that made them who they were. One of them fiddled nervously with the edge of the couch cushion, twisting it between his fingers. Another's gaze wandered to the painting on the wall, tracing the brushstrokes almost absent-mindedly. And the third, he just sat quietly, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips, as if he were holding back a thought he didn't want to share aloud. Something shifted when our eyes met, not in a dramatic movie-like way, but subtly, like the room itself had leaned in just a little closer. There was warmth there, an unspoken understanding, the kind of connection that doesn't need words to exist. I realized that I hadn't noticed it before, the way people could reveal themselves in small, almost imperceptible ways, the quiet honesty that came after the bravado and laughter had settled. The tallest one leaned forward suddenly, as if remembering something, and I felt my pulse tick a little faster, though I wasn't entirely sure why. He told me about a mistake he'd made at work that week, something minor but embarrassing, and the others teased him gently, their voices soft with camaraderie rather than cruelty. I could feel the sincerity and the apology in his words, the vulnerability, and it struck a chord deep inside me. I realized that these weren't just idle stories. They were small windows into their lives, glimpses of people who, like me, had layers beneath the surface that rarely got seen. I smiled at them, and I think they noticed. The room seemed to settle even more, the laughter quieting into soft murmurs. I realized that I was actually enjoying their company, not just tolerating it. The warm, almost intoxicating feeling of being included, being seen, and being able to see in return was unfamiliar yet comforting. At one point, someone reached for the tea I had poured earlier, and our fingers brushed again. It was brief, almost accidental, but I felt it nonetheless. That small contact, so innocent on the surface, carried an undercurrent of something unexpected, a reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, connections could form in ways you didn't anticipate. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, gentle and steady, a feeling of being present, alive, and appreciated. I found myself telling a small story about my own week, something mundane about the grocery store, and a minor mishap with a misplaced shopping list. They listened with genuine interest, asking questions and laughing at the right moments, and I felt a kind of relief I hadn't realized I needed. It was strange how these men, who I had barely interacted with before, could make me feel understood, even in such a small and simple way. As the sky outside deepened into twilight, the room seemed to glow with a soft, amber light. Shadows danced lightly across the walls, and the air carried the faint scent of wine and wood polish. I noticed the subtle rise and fall of their chests as they settled more comfortably onto the couch, the way one's hair fell slightly over his forehead, the way another kept adjusting his sleeve absent-mindedly. Each small detail felt intimate in its own right, a testament to the slow, unspoken trust that had begun to form in the space between us. I realized then that the evening had taken on a rhythm of its own, a gentle unfolding that wasn't planned but felt entirely right. Their voices became softer, their laughter less boisterous and more warm, the kind of laughter that carried a sense of ease and familiarity. I felt a part of that rhythm, a participant in a quiet symphony of human connection, and it was exhilarating in its subtlety. By the time my husband came in from the garage, humming to himself and carrying the faint scent of sawdust and motor oil, we were all sitting comfortably together. The earlier tension dissolved into something lighter, more authentic. I looked around the room and realized that the unexpected had become a small blessing. Sometimes I thought the most meaningful experiences weren't planned. They simply arrived, quietly, when you allowed yourself to be present and attentive. And in that moment, with 3 of my husband's friends quietly chatting around me, I felt more alive, more seen, and more connected than I had in years. It was a revelation not shouted or dramatized, but whispered in the soft cadence of shared stories, gentle laughter, and subtle gestures. I didn't know how the night would unfold, but I felt ready to discover it, fully, without reservation, and with an open heart. By the time the evening had fully settled in, the room felt almost suspended in its own quiet world. The golden light from the lamp in the corner softened the edges of the furniture, wrapping everything in a warm glow. Outside, the sky had darkened completely, and the faint hum of distant traffic reminded me that the world beyond these walls was still moving, but in here, time seemed to slow. They were no longer the loud, slightly clumsy men who had burst into my room just hours earlier. Something had shifted. The tallest one leaned back on the couch, relaxed now, his arm draped lazily along the back. The one with the gentle voice had his legs tucked under him, and his hands rested lightly on his knees, calm and composed. The third, who had seemed quieter at first, now spoke more freely, sharing stories I hadn't known I wanted to hear, the small regrets, the missed opportunities, the little joys they had tucked away in the corners of their lives. I listened, utterly absorbed. There was a rhythm to our conversation now, an unspoken understanding that made everything feel natural, almost inevitable. I realized I had forgotten to think about anything else. My chores, my husband, the quiet hum of the dishwasher, all of it had faded into the background. The only thing that mattered in that moment was the space we had carved out together, a fragile little world where openness was not just allowed, but embraced. At one point, the tallest one laughed at a story he told about a fishing trip gone wrong, and his laughter was rich, unguarded. I found myself smiling in a way I hadn't in a long time, the sound warm and effortless. There was something in the way he looked at me then, not leering, not suggestive, just genuinely present. And I realized that presence itself was intoxicating, the simple act of being seen, acknowledged, and accepted without pretense. I told a small story of my own, one I hadn't shared with anyone in years, a moment from my childhood, silly but vivid, about getting caught in the rain on a family picnic. As I spoke, I noticed the way their attention shifted entirely toward me, their eyes soft and receptive, their smiles encouraging. It was the first time I had felt completely heard in a long while. A subtle warmth spread through my chest, a reminder that emotional connection could be just as fulfilling as any grand gesture or romantic notion. At one point, the gentle one reached for his glass of tea and accidentally brushed my hand. The contact was brief, a simple collision of skin, yet I felt it in a way that was unexpected, a spark of human closeness that felt tender, almost sacred. I caught his eye and we exchanged a quiet look, a mutual acknowledgement of the fragile intimacy that had formed between us. It wasn't bold or overt, but it was real, and that made it powerful. We fell into a quieter conversation then, less about stories and more about feelings. They spoke of the small pressures in their lives, the regrets they carried lightly, the little victories that often went unnoticed. I shared in turn, hesitating at first, but the warmth of their attention made it easier. There was a kind of trust building between us, fragile yet undeniable, a recognition that these moments, the small admissions, the shared laughter, the gentle touches, were more significant than any of us could have anticipated. Time seemed to bend as the night deepened. I found myself observing them not just as my husband's friends, but as human beings with layers and histories, moments of vulnerability and courage that rarely saw the light of day. I noticed the small details, the way the gentle one's fingers trembled slightly when he reached for his cup, the quiet, almost imperceptible sigh from the quieter one, the tilt of the tallest one's head as he listened intently. Each gesture spoke volumes, and I felt a deep empathy stirring within me. When my husband finally came back into the room, wiping his hands on a rag from the garage, I realized that the intimacy that had formed wasn't obvious to him, at least, not in the way it existed for me, but it didn't matter. The room felt full, alive, and layered with connection. I caught myself smiling at the sight of him, not out of guilt, but because I realized how fortunate I was to witness these men as they truly were, in all their flawed, human, beautiful honesty. As the evening wound down, I felt a quiet sense of anticipation for the coming moments, not for drama, not for excitement, but for the calm, tender revelations that could only emerge in a space of trust and genuine presence. The night was still young, yet it had already gifted me something profound, the understanding that human connection, even unexpected and unplanned, could carry a depth and richness that words alone could never fully capture. And as I settled back into my chair, feeling the warmth of the room and the subtle presence of those around me, I realized that the evening had shifted something inside me. There was a new awareness of how deeply small gestures, sincere attention, and gentle understanding could resonate. I didn't know exactly where this night would lead, but I felt ready to embrace it fully, to allow myself to experience it without fear, hesitation, or judgment. It was rare, I thought, for life to offer moments so simple yet so profound, moments that reminded you of the beauty of presence, empathy, and connection, and I intended to savor every second. The night had grown quiet outside, the hum of the city distant now, almost muted. Inside, the room was still warm from the soft light and the lingering presence of conversation, laughter, and gentle silences. I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing it, caught in the rhythm of the evening, and now I exhaled slowly, feeling a calm settle over me. The three of them had become more than just my husband's friends over the hours. They were companions in a quiet journey, witnesses to stories I rarely shared and mirrors to the small truths I carried inside. I noticed the way the tallest one leaned back, relaxed, his gaze soft, no longer searching for attention but simply present. The gentle one's hand rested loosely on the arm of the couch, and I found myself drawn to the steadiness of it. And the third, who had seemed the quietest, now laughed easily, a sound that felt like it belonged in the room as much as any lamp or chair. I thought about how unexpected this evening had been. I had anticipated little more than minor annoyance at uninvited visitors, maybe a touch of frustration at the intrusion into my routine. But instead, the night had unfolded like a quiet revelation, a reminder that connection could appear in the most unassuming ways. I had felt seen, listened to, and appreciated, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in small, gentle ways: the shared laughter, the accidental touches, the patient attention to each story. At one point, I found myself sitting a little straighter, realizing how deeply I had been paying attention to them and they to me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it mattered. The warmth of the room was more than just the lighting. It was the warmth of recognition, of mutual respect, of understanding that didn't need to be explained. It was a rare gift, and I savored it quietly. My husband eventually joined us in the living room, carrying the faint scent of his workshop and the gentle energy of someone comfortable in his own space. I looked at him, at all of them, and smiled. It wasn't a smile of guilt or secrecy. It was a smile of contentment, gratitude, and recognition of the unexpected bonds that could form when people allowed themselves to be present and open. As the evening wound down, I poured the last cup of tea and handed it around. We sat together in a calm silence, letting the moments stretch naturally, enjoying the simplicity of being together without expectation or performance. There was a profound sense of peace in that, a reminder that connection didn't need to be loud or dramatic to be meaningful. I thought about the subtle discoveries I had made about myself tonight, the capacity to enjoy company in unexpected ways, to appreciate warmth and attention, to feel alive in quiet intimacy. I thought about how life, even in its later years, could still surprise, still offer moments of joy, laughter, and reflection that felt as vivid as any memory from decades past. When the three finally said their goodbyes, their voices soft, their steps careful as they navigated the hallway, I felt a small tug of wistfulness. The room felt emptier without them, yet it was filled with something else, the quiet residue of connection, the subtle glow of shared humanity, and the knowledge that moments like this, unexpected, tender, and genuine, could transform the ordinary into something unforgettable. After the door closed behind them, I sank back into my armchair, savoring the silence. The faint scent of tea lingered in the air, mingling with the warmth of the evening, and I allowed myself to reflect on what had happened. I realized that life's most meaningful experiences didn't always arrive with warning or ceremony. Sometimes they arrived quietly, gently, in the presence of laughter, attention, and the soft, steady rhythm of human connection. And in that stillness I smiled again, knowing that I had been part of something rare tonight, a moment of true presence and subtle intimacy that would stay with me long after the lights were turned off and the house returned to its usual quiet. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was real, it was tender, and it was profoundly alive. I took a slow, deep breath, letting it fill me completely, and I felt a warmth in my chest that wasn't just from the tea. It was the warmth of understanding, of connection, and of life's quiet surprises. And for the first time that evening, I felt fully, completely at peace with it.